Welcome to SmartKnowledgeU podcast number 3. Today's podcast is brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/SmartKnowledgeU. That's www.audible.com/SmartKnowledgeU. There are over 150,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And after you get your 30-day free trial, if you want to learn more about today's podcast topic, which is the dumbing down of society by industrialists and bankers that reprogram children through the institutional academic system, I highly recommend selecting one of the following books as your free download. The first book is called Dumbing Us Down: The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling by John Gatto. That's Gatto. And the second book is also by John Gatto, and it's called Weapons of Mass Instruction: A School Teacher's Journey Through the Dark World of Compulsory Schooling. So the easiest way to find these books, which are an excellent companion to today's podcast topic, is to go to www.audible.com and do an author search for John Gatto. As well, you can go to the YouTube podcast and read the description box where I will place the names of these books as well. Okay, so let's get started with today's podcast. Today, I'm going to discuss a lot of information that has been well documented by Charlotte Iserbyt. Actually, I think it's Iserbyt is how to pronounce her last name. So who is Charlotte Iserbyt? Charlotte Iserbyt was the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Educational Research and Improvement of the U.S. Department of Education during President Ronald Reagan's first term in office, during which she used her tenure as a cabinet member to access many classified documents from the Department of Education to learn about the true purpose of institutional academics in the United States, which was a model that the industrialists and bankers eventually exported to the rest of the world. So everything I say in today's podcast actually applies to your schooling system no matter where you live in the world today. Ms. Iserbyt has documented the gradual transformation of her once academically successful education system into one devoted to training children to become compliant human resources to be used by government agents, bankers, and industrialists for their own purposes. Now I know what a lot of people are going to say upon hearing that. You're going to say, oh, this sounds like some unbelievable conspiracy theory. But remember, I'm going to quote a lot from John Gatto, who was a teacher in the academic system, and Ms. Iserbyt, who worked for the U.S. Department of Education. So she actually worked as a government cabinet member and had access to classified government documents that actually outlined all of the purposes of U.S. education, which seems to be contrary to learning. So again, during this podcast, I will read directly from government and other official educational documents that prove up Ms. Iserbyt's premise. Now, furthermore, there's also a ton of anecdotal information that proves up this premise as well. Before I even get into the meat of this podcast, most of you that have been listening to my, watching my videos on YouTube or listening to my podcasts, or have been reading my blog, which has now been running for 8 years, I believe now, at my website, www.smartknowledgeu.com. You know I live in Asia now. And as such, I have friends all throughout different Asian countries and friends that live in Japan. And I have friends that live in Japan, and none of whom have stopped eating sushi or seem to be concerned about the massive amounts of radiation still leaking from the failed Fukushima reactors into the ocean. Even though there are tons of documented evidence that proves that 4 years later from the Fukushima disaster and the tsunami, which happened in March of 2011, I believe, the reactors are still leaking tons of radiated water into the ocean. In fact, I'll post a documentary from alternate media source Vice that you can watch about this that proves the Japanese government and TEPCO, which was the Japanese energy company that ran these Fukushima reactors, that prove that they have lied to the public about the extent of the ongoing danger from this nuclear disaster. So what does this have to do with today's podcast about academics? Well, it has a lot to do with it, because if you listen to this full podcast, you will understand why people so blindly believe government, industrialists, and banker lies all the time. In fact, in this podcast, I'll explain why the behavioral modification and Skinnerian operant conditioning embedded in institutional academia today causes all of us to so blindly believe people in positions of authority, even when they are flat out lying to us. And in addition, many other education experts have independently confirmed Miss Iserbyt's findings. For example, we can turn to Sir Ken Robinson, who a lot of you may know if you're interested in the topic of education and are listening to this podcast. He's a prominent UK educator, and he recently discussed a longitudinal study of kindergarten children that asked them a very simple question. Basically, the study asked them how many different uses they could come up with for a paperclip over time. So a longitudinal study, for those of you that don't know, basically follows the same test subjects over time. So they would ask the same group of children over time the same question. Now, 200 plus answers to how many uses one could come up with for a paperclip shows real creativity that borders on a creative genius level. When first asked this question at kindergarten age, 98% of the children graded out at a genius level. Now, this is a scary thing as far as the results that came after. So after 5 years, just a mere 5 years of being herded through the institutional academic system, when they're only aged 8 to 10 years, those that graded out at genius level with the same question was nearly cut in half, with only 50% grading out at genius level, down from 98%. After another 5 more years in the institutional academic system, the number of divergent thinking geniuses had fallen further still. And other longitudinal studies that tracked children out to their mid-20s discovered that only 2% would grade out at a genius level. So the question that we want to address in this podcast is, why does institutional academia cause a massive drop-off in creative genius over a 20-year period from 98% to 2%? And today our podcast will uncover the reasons why education actually kills critical and divergent thinking when the majority of people mistakenly believe it increases it. Now, of course, I'm not talking about education being the equivalent of learning, because education, if it were truly learning, would increase critical and divergent thinking. I only say it kills critical and divergent thinking because I'm talking about education and the institutional schooling system and the institutional academic system, because that does not encourage learning. So there's a term that's used for young men that spend the better part of their lives under the care of the U.S. penal system. And we often say that these men have been institutionalized. And basically that just means the penal system has stripped these men of the ability to succeed because their mentality has been reduced to that of an incarcerated, institutionalized person, because they spent the greater portion of their youth incarcerated versus free in society. So unfortunately, I believe the same term of institutionalized applies just as much to any child that has gone through the institutional academic system, as the academic system deliberately strips away a child's independence and divergent critical thinking skills the longer they are processed through that system. So much as someone that is processed through the penal system, it is reduced to institutionalized mental state. Children that have been processed through the academic system are similarly reduced to a lesser state of mentality, I guess would be, or state of intellectuality, I guess would be a better way of putting it. So, the interesting thing is I would be highly interested to see the results of a longitudinal study conducted on homeschool children versus those that go through the institutional academic system, because my guess would be that homeschool kindergarten children will still grade out in the 90th percentile or higher with the same question that Sir Ken Robinson referred to, and I believe they would still be grading out in the 90th percentile 5 and 10 years down the road, as long as they were still homeschooled, as long as they did not enter the institutional academic system, whereas that percentage is dropping off to 30%, 20%, down from 98%. I believe homeschool kids would still be grading out at 90 percentile or higher for creative geniuses. but I have not been able to find a study just with homeschool kids. So that would be something interesting if there are any researchers out there that want to do this study, because you can easily just Google Ken Robinson longitudinal study paperclip and find that study and replicate it with homeschool children. So when I think about this topic that I'm discussing today, I have seen this all over the world. So that's why I said it applies to you no matter where in the world you live. So even though I was born and raised in the US, I've lived in a couple other countries as well. And in fact, after living in Japan, I met many Japanese university students that quoted the following Japanese proverb when I asked them to explain their disenchantment and disillusionment with the Japanese academic system. They would quote a proverb that says, "The nail that sticks out must be hammered down," which is a really interesting proverb that like almost all Japanese school children know that proverb, because it's basically saying about the Japanese academic system, God forbid if a Japanese school child doesn't agree with everyone else in the classroom and agree with their teacher. And if that happens, if there's any kind of dissent, even if it's intellectual dissent, logical dissent that is correct, they must be herded into believing there's only one correct answer for every question. So there's been this debate about education that's been going on for centuries. Even Aristotle once said, quote, "Educated men are as much superior to uneducated men as the living are to the dead," end quote. And I would absolutely agree with that quote, but the only problem is that people graduate from certain pedigrees. They think they graduate from Harvard or Princeton or Oxford, and that makes them smart, and they don't realize that they are basically being subjected to Skinnerian operant conditioning and behavioral modification techniques, and may actually not even know the truth about a lot of topics they believe just because they paid $50,000 a year to attend these programs, that they are the experts, when in fact, I've learned the exact opposite is true, especially when it comes to finance and banking with a lot of these schools and a lot of these graduates from these schools. So one must receive the proper education, and institutional education is not the proper education. So even the Aristotle quote, "The educated men are as much superior to uneducated men as the living are to the dead," only applies to those that have received the smart knowledge, or the type of education where that actually promotes their learning instead of stifles it. So, often people ask me to explain the origins of my company's name, SmartKnowledgeU, and I answer by saying that access to the right information would grant us success in life. Whereas if we lived our entire lives believing the information we were taught in classrooms at institutional academics was correct, then success will always elude us. In other words, we can have 10 times as much knowledge as the person with whom we are in competition, but if we have the wrong type of knowledge, and our competitors have 1/10 of the knowledge we have, but his or her 1/10 is 100% the right knowledge or smart knowledge, then he will beat us. So that's, basically why I decided to name my company SmartKnowledgeU, because I don't believe it's just knowledge that will give us the key to a successful life, no matter how you define success, but it is the smart knowledge. So again, I don't think any of us should ever make the mistake of thinking that just by attending a so-called elite school that we will gain access to the smart knowledge you need. Because I attended a so-called top 5 elite university as an undergrad in America. So you attend a top 5 school in America. That goes a long way on your CV to gaining access to the best jobs in America. But I don't believe it should be that way, because, despite the fact that I attended a top 5 master's program in public policy and a top 15 master program in business administration, at the end of all this so-called elite schooling, I came to the conclusion that these programs gave me all of the wrong knowledge and not any of the smart knowledge I need to succeed in life. So please don't get fooled by just thinking if you go to an elite school that you will gain the knowledge you want. You may gain the connections. I do grant that a lot of people go to these top schools just to get connections to presidents' sons or cabinet members' sons and daughters, and who can hook them up later in life. But that is a whole different story than gaining any type of education, building your critical thinking skills, and gaining actual learning. So let me begin by just even looking at teacher pay. What keeps the quality of learning in institutions of education so non-existent, which is, ironic, right? So in 1997, there were 46.4 million public school students in America. And during 1993 to 1994, the average per pupil expenditure was $6,330 in 1996 constant dollars, that is. So parents of homeschool children spend a maximum of $1,000 per year. This was, per 1997, and usually have the same results as, or even better results. I would say better as far as the type of learning, but same type of results on standardized tests, right? That public school students, in which $6,330 per student was spent, obtained. So why is that? Why in public schools they spend more than 6 times a year in money than homeschool students, and homeschool students can still test out as well as these public school students. So the question, if we really want to get to the bottom of that question, or the answer to that question, if you look at it from another angle, I have several friends that actually still teach in the LA, Los Angeles Unified School District, and if they teach, like, say, 60 different students, and the school district is spending $7,000 per student. Actually, I have no idea. Let me see if I can find it on Google real quickly right now. So just bear with me. How much money does the LI Unified School District spend per student? Okay, let's see what comes up. Holy moly, he says that LA Unified School District spends $29,780 per student. Okay, so let's just round that up to $30,000. So they're spending $30,000 per student. Okay, so if one of my friends teaches 60 different students, they're spending $30,000 per student, then what is that? $1.8 million. That means the school district is spending $1.8 million on the students they teach. Okay, so now knowing that some teachers, the school district is spending $1.8 million on the students they teach, let's see what is the average salary for a teacher. Okay, what is the average salary for a teacher in the LI Unified School District? Okay, new teachers with regular credentials earn beginning minimum salaries of $45,637. The top, a 75% average. Let's see. The median salary is $65,500. Okay, so why is it that the median salary is $65,500, half earning below that, half earning above, when they're spending, say, $1.5 to $2 million on the students they teach? Why can't they increase these teacher salaries to, say, $150,000 a year? Think about how much, when they're spending $1.5 million to $2 million on the students they teach, they can't take $150,000 out of that $1.5 to $2 million to pay the teachers. Think about how much better quality teachers would be attracted at $150,000 or $200,000 or even $300,000 a year versus what they pay teachers today. Perhaps that's the answer. Perhaps the answer as to why teachers are not paid anywhere near what they should be paid is because the architects of the institutional academic system, namely the criminal banksters and the industrialists, do not want great teachers that will inspire students to think. Now, even though that sounds like an oxymoron and against what the academic system should be, I'll prove that that is the case in this podcast. Instead, the role of the teacher inside the institutional academic system is to transform their students into an unthinking, obedient slave of the system. And this has been meticulously documented. So I am going to go through this podcast and actually read you quotes, without even my opinions, just quotes from education documents that Ms. Iserbeet has uncovered. So, one thing that's obvious to me on the whole homeschool versus institutionalized student is the superior mental development of homeschool children. Like, just again, this is on a purely anecdotal level, but I think these anecdotal stories are important because if you ever listen to interviews of homeschooled teenage actors like Dakota L. Fanning when they were teenage years, I think her younger sister Elle is still a teenager, but when they were like say 13, 14, or 15 years of age, the first thing that jumps out at you is how eloquent they are and how articulate they are as young adults, and that fact that they're twice as articulate as an average 14-year-old. And why is it? Is it because children, as they are processed through the institutional academic system, are taught to always stay in line? As is apparent by, like if you look in the classroom, the neat rows of desks in classrooms, the fact that they're told not to talk out of order and to speak up only when called upon by a teacher. In other words, children are being trained just like a dog, just like Pavlovian conditioning of salivating when they hear the bell ring because they know the meal is coming, to be obedient. And that is why a child that's processed through the system is afraid to take principled stands in life later as a young adult and to speak out against injustices. Whereas our homeschool children, not subjected to these rigorously constructed paradigms of obedience instilled in the institutionalized classroom environment, is not afraid to engage others in a much more precocious adult manner. So homeschool children have not been conditioned as their classroom peers have been to speak out only if a positive reward or response is forthcoming. Instead, homeschool children will speak out against injustices even if there's no reward for doing so. So that's the key thing. Institutional academics teaches children to basically seek a reward for a correct response. So unless they perceive later in life as an adult that they're going to receive a reward, they will not take a principled stand against injustices. Because what is the reward? There's not a reward. In fact, there's a penalty for doing so, as you'll be prosecuted for doing so, correct? So for those that don't realize the purpose of institutional academia, what is the true purpose? These facts will probably be pretty hard to swallow, especially for parents that are spending tens of thousands of dollars to send their children to private schools as teenagers, or even I've heard of even grade schools, because I remember when I used to work as a banker in Citigroup, I heard of some hedge fund manager petitioning Sandy Weil to get his, and this is ridiculous, his kindergarten age child, like a 6-year-old child, into some elite school in New York that would cost $30,000 a year in tuition for a 6-year-old. It's crazy. So the more we quickly come to this realization of what the institutional academic system really is, the more quickly we can stop wasting our money and subjecting our children to behavioral modification, brainwashing techniques inherent in every institutional academic system. So the purpose of institutional academics is socialization, conditioning, not learning as it should be. And in fact, 100 years ago, it was learning, and it wasn't this way. So I'm going to discuss the timeline of how bankers and industrialists have changed the purpose of education as well. So one clear example of how we can see that there is a deliberate agenda to education is that anytime parents of the children that are attending these schools propose change or challenge change to these behavioral modification programs, they are met with extreme, I would say radical resistance and a shoot the messenger response by the academics. And in fact, I'm going to post again a link. And again, for any of these references, you can go find this podcast, just called like SmartKnowledgeU podcast number 3 on YouTube, and look in the video description. It'll find all the links I'm talking about in this podcast. And for those that want to download it as well, you can find it on my blog. Before I forget, I'm going to start posting them on SoundCloud too. So on SoundCloud, I haven't set up my account, but I think I just will name it SmartKnowledgeU. So you can search for SmartKnowledgeU, find the podcast on SoundCloud as downloadable MP3 files too. But back to my point. In Florida, school administrators, in particular school board chair Kathleen Curatolo, repeatedly admonished and belittled parents and marginalized their concerns about the validity of the curriculum that teachers were teaching their kids when basically the parents challenged the curricula. So you will see, if you go to the link and find, which I highly recommend you do, to go watch the short, they're only like 5-minute videos, where school board chair Kathleen Curatolo in Florida assumes the deliberate tactic of repeatedly absolving any school board member of any culpability or any responsibility, and absolving them of any criticism, when she repeatedly and rudely interrupts and scolds parents that are trying to explain which specific school board members and their policies they have a problem with. And when they say that this, such and such school board member is instilling this policy in my child's school and I don't like it, the school board chair repeatedly directs the parents, interrupts the parents, belittles them, and says, discuss the issue, not the person. Discuss the issue, never refer to the person, which is totally ridiculous because it's absolutely a deliberate tactic on Kathleen Curatolo, and it's despicable that she's a school board chair because she's not even listening to any of the parents or will not take any of their concerns, and will absolve any school board member of any type of criticism for any stupid policy decisions the school board members may have undertaken that actually succeeds in dumbing down the children in that school district. And I have seen the same scene in Florida repeat itself over and over between grievances aired by parents and school administrators all over the United States. So again, I would highly recommend, if you're just listening to this podcast on a downloadable MP3, to go over to SmartKnowledgeU YouTube channel, find podcast number 3, and watch the links of the parent school board meetings in Florida. Because if you have a child in school now and have never attended a school board meeting to air any grievances, watch these videos, because it will make it crystal clear that school boards have an agenda to ensure that your children's behavior will be modified by the academic system to become blindly obedient to those in positions of authority. And that many school districts have zero interest in actually listening to or addressing any of the parents' grievances against them. So you will also further understand, if you watch these videos, I believe, that people in charge of the education curricula in the U.S. have predetermined that there will be no challenges and no changes to the behavioral modification programs that have been instilled in U.S. classrooms. It's really interesting to me because Henry Ford, this is a famous quote that a lot of people know, once stated about the global banking system, quote, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be revolution before tomorrow morning," end quote. Now, I believe this would have been the case 100 years ago, but unfortunately, because of the vast modifications made to the traditional classroom all around the world post the Industrial Revolution, I don't believe this statement stands anymore or has any validity today, because industrialists and bankers have done such a great job of conditioning all of us to become obedient to their authority through the different operating conditioning they instill in the academic school system, that so few people, even if we all understood the wicked immorality of the global banking system today, I believe there are so few of us that would have the courage and individualism required to rebel against the very people that enslave us and tell them to listen to them. So if you pause this podcast, came back, and you just finished watching those videos I referenced, then you'll understand that if the majority of education administrators and university presidents expressed the same lack of tolerance about race that they expressed regarding requests and opinions to reshape education curricula, that they would all be correctly labeled as massive bigots and the equivalent of racist Klansmen. So the absolute stonewalling of parents that question the educational curricula and the whole shoot the messenger tactic should aptly illustrate how carefully the elite control educational curricula all around the world and disallow any type of the slightest deviation from the program of behavioral modification and engineering. T.H. Bell. Okay, I'm going to discuss T.H. Bell. Who's T.H. Bell? T.H. Bell was a U.S. Secretary of Education. He stated, quote, "We need to create a crisis to get consensus in order to bring about change," end quote, in the education system. Interestingly enough, to illustrate that this whole concept of creating some kind of crisis, whether it's a false flag or a real crisis, to bring about change is a standard operating procedure of the elite. Decades later, this same modus operandus was voiced regarding geopolitical change desired by the elites. Because if you look at PNAC, which is the Project for the New American Century, which is headed by former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney, former U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, former Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, former VP Chief of Staff Louis Libby, former Education Secretary William J. Bennett, Richard Pearl, and others, then you will understand that the goal of the Project for the New American Century was that America's military must rule out even the possibility of a serious global or regional challenger anywhere in the world. So this document said that the regime of Saddam Hussein must be toppled immediately by U.S. force if necessary, and that the entire Middle East must be reordered according to America's agenda. So PNAC concluded that, quote, I'm going to read the direct quote instead of just paraphrasing that document now, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. End quote. Page 51 of PNAC's document, Rebuilding America's Defenses, published in 1997. Now note that one of the architects of this strategy was a former U.S. Secretary of Education. So what is a former U.S. Secretary of Education doing talking about military policy? Again, in a lot of my previous videos and podcasts, I talk about the importance of connecting the dots. If you think it's odd that a former U.S. Education Secretary would be involved in forming U.S. military strategy, once you begin connecting the dots and understand that the same MO of creating crisis, whether real or false, to bring about extreme change very quickly is the same MO used by the elite to change all facets of life that they desire to change, then the inclusion of the former U.S. Education Secretary in PNAC is no longer viewed as odd at all. And becomes even easier to understand when we look at directives uncovered by Charlotte Iserbyt's government documents that she read. She said, when she talked about how fascinating these documents that she gained access to while working for the U.S. Department of Education under Ronald Reagan, she said often people would ask her colleagues, why are you staying so late? Because she would stay well after office hours, late into the night, reading all these documents because they were so fascinating to her. So she said that the goals of U.S. education, according to the document she uncovered while working at the U.S. Department of Education, were as follows. 1. To use the schools to change America from a free individual nation to a socialist global state, just one of many socialist states which will be subservient to the United States nation's charter, not the U.S. Constitution. 2. To brainwash our children, starting at birth, to reject individualism in favor of collectivism. 3. To reject higher academic standards in favor of OBE/ISO 1400-9000 egalitarianism. If you don't know what OBE is, it stands for Outcome-Based Education. I discuss this more in detail in our Smart Wealth online education program. To reject number, what am I up to? 1, 2, 3, 4? I'm not sure if it's 4 or 5. To reject truth and absolutes in favor of tolerance, situational ethics, and consensus. So that's number 5. Number 6, to reject American values in favor of internationalist values or globalism. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 6, to reject freedom to choose one's career in favor of the totalitarian kindergarten through 12 school to work outcome-based education process coordinated through United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So, more importantly, it's the desire of the elites to train young people to no longer believe in right and wrong. Because if there are no rights or wrongs, then there can be no people wanting to right or wrong. Or more specifically, they want to stamp out the people that will want to right their wrongs that they impose upon us. So, Iserbyt stated that every one of the above goals I just read from official government Department of Education documents that outline the purpose of education in America have now been implemented. And again, if you want to look at the footnotes, Iserbyt has footnoted everything that she discusses. There are footnotes that provide the exact documents that contain these goals, and you can basically just go to Amazon.com and buy Iserbyt's book about education, as it's all footnoted there. Now, the other interesting aspect of behavioral modification goals and institutional academics is an emphasis on immediate gratification. So I think the academic system teaches us and ingrains in us as a young child, which stays with us as we become adults, that we must have an immediate reward for the one correct response to a question. And though I have no idea if teachers in the US still use the types of incentives that they conditioned us with when I was a kid, I remember dozens of times I received candy from teachers in the US for providing a correct response to a question. So I remember receiving candy corn around Halloween. I remember receiving Jolly Ranchers, and I remember receiving cookies. So this teaching technique that reinforces the immediate gratification strategy. And in fact, I believe why immediate gratification is embedded in a lot of the institutional academic system is that the strategy is to keep people distracted once these children evolve into young adults, or maybe I should say devolve, because the purpose of this seems to be to enhance de-evolution rather than evolution. So I think that is partially, if you think about it, you can link people's short attention spans, the ADD, attention deficit disorders, to these immediate gratification strategies of teaching. That's why people say now if you don't capture someone's attention the first 5 seconds of a YouTube video, you've lost the viewer. That's why people depend on media. Mass media depends on sensationalist sound bites and videos and headlines in news media that lack any truth, just to gain clicks and views. Because I've seen that so many times where I see a headline and then I click and read the article, and the article is actually direct opposition to the headline, which was a false headline, just built to capture a click from a viewer. So another way, which is really interesting because I thought about this, in which we can see the need for immediate gratification that's taught in the institutional academic system leaking into American society in general, is in martial arts. Because when I trained in martial arts, and I trained in martial arts for years, when I trained in the US, I thought that multiple color belt system was standard across the world. You know, the white, yellow, green, blue, purple, brown, black. I think that's complete. It was only when I left America, lived in Japan for a while, studied martial arts there, that I learned the multiple color belt thing was an American invention. Because when I trained in Japan, there's only white and black belts in Japan. You're either a student, no matter how skilled you are, if you're not an expert, and then you remain a white belt for for potentially years, and then when you become skilled enough to actually teach others and become a teacher, you graduate to expert status and gain your black belt. So it's interesting because in America, I believe this is entirely associated with the immediate gratification strategy that's taught in schools. If your belt color remains white for years, based upon how young children are taught in school, then not only do the children feel like they aren't making progress, even if their skills are advancing greatly, their parents get upset. Why is my child still a white belt? Why isn't my child a yellow belt now? They need to see that belt color changing to fulfill their need for immediate gratification. So that's why I believe American dojos invented the multiple color belt system to gratify the need of American children to be rewarded immediately for their progress. So it's fascinating to see the need for immediate gratification built even into the martial arts system, where there's a massive difference in the belt system between dojos in the West and dojos in the East. So the important thing is, like I said, there's a massive difference between education and learning. They're not synonymous, although they're used synonymously a lot by the media. So you can have education with zero learning. And in fact, because learning, what is learning? Learning is really the result of modifying and changing the electrical paths of neural conduction in the brain. So why the elites deem behavioral modification as an essential part of institutional academics is because if they could succeed in changing the hard wiring of young adults' thinking processes before they became hardwired into adults, they knew that they could control us as adults. And again, let me use a martial arts analogy, because in martial arts, we train in techniques thousands of times. So it becomes, basically it becomes instinct, right? And we don't think about how to react when we're attacked. So we'll train a technique thousands and thousands of times. And this is truly, truly important for combat skills. But when it comes to learning, we should never apply this technique to learning, though it's rampant in institutional schools all over the world today. This is what bankers and industrialists wanted to achieve with education. They wanted to wipe out individual thought, critical thinking, and questioning skills and condition the responses of everyone. So now, like I said, I'm going to discuss the timeline that bankers like the Rockefellers and industrialists like the Carnegies implemented to achieve the results I thus far discussed in this podcast. So in January 12th of 1902, the General Education Board was incorporated by an act of U.S. Congress and also funded by John D. Rockefeller for the purpose of establishing an educational laboratory to experiment with early innovations in education. Okay, hold that thought for 1 second because I gotta get a quick drink of water. I'll be right back. Okay, so sorry for the brief interruption. People don't realize that powerful elements within the U.S. that directed the education movement in the U.S., specifically the Rockefellers, admired communism and wanted to implement as many communist principles as possible in America, the most important of which still exists today, an alleged constitutional republic. So, by the way, there's also a reason why all U.S. presidents always refer to spreading democracy. Why don't they ever say the U.S. was not even founded as a democracy, it's founded as a constitutional republic? And a lot of people don't know there are vast and very critical differences to freedom, to a citizen's freedom, between a constitutional republic and a democracy. Constitutional republic is far superior for interests of freedom than a democracy. So this is why U.S. presidents always refer to spreading democracy across the world, even though the U.S. is not a democracy, but a constitutional republic. So however, this topic is for another day, because I could talk an hour just on that topic. But in any event, the two communist pillars that still exist in most allegedly democratic countries around the world are central bank, whose purpose it is to allow bankers to seize a monopolistic control over a nation's monetary supply, and number two, an education system model after the Soviet Union's. So when we look at the progression, so that was in the very start of the 20th century in 1902, that the Rockefellers funded basically an educational laboratory to see how they could best control people through the educational system. Then we have William Foster's book, Toward a Soviet America, printed by Elgin Enterprises in 1932. Foster, who was the national chairman of the Communist Party of the United States, argued for the establishment of a U.S. Department of Education. So it was a communist that argued for the establishment of a U.S. Department of Education. Now, again, just because I think it's important to look at the quotes, absent of even my opinions, I'm going to just read, again, a direct quote, because you cannot argue with a direct quote, even though people want to, and say, oh, that's just your opinion. This is a direct quote. He said that he argued for the establishment of, quote, a U.S. Department of Education, implementation of a scientific materialist philosophy, studies revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois ideology, students taught on the basis of Marxian dialectical materialism, internationalism, and general ethics of a new socialist society, present obsolete methods of teaching will be present obsolete methods of teaching will be superseded by scientific pedagogy. The whole basis and organization of capitalist science will be revolutionized. Science will become materialistic, hence truly scientific. God will be banished from the laboratories as well as from the schools, end quote. If you think about the stated goals of an American educator in 1932, which William Z. Foster was, it's scary to realize that all of these goals have since been implemented in American schools today. It's even scarier to think of how narrow and rigid the high school curricula is today, that's typically referred to as college prep courses. The college prep curriculum usually consists of a certain amount of credits in a very uniform curriculum and very specified subject materials. But if you're a logical person, really Think about this. Why should a teenager say that he already knows what he wants to do in life? Say a teenager that already knows he wants to become a music producer. Why should he be required to take math? Wouldn't he have more success in his profession and his career and in life if he took a course related to music production instead of math? Wouldn't that best serve his interests? Because there are teenagers like that already know exactly what they want to do. For example, like if he knows exactly he wants to become an astronaut, then he should be allowed to form his curriculum that's specific to his interests. It shouldn't be just uniform like it is today. That is insane. Isn't he? So is he really going to be dumber if he doesn't take math? Are engineers dumber than doctors because they don't understand disease epidemiology? And on the same hand, can we argue that doctors are dumber than engineers because they don't understand what are safe weight loads for certain building structures? So this is the point I'm making. Why is everyone required to take math? Why is everyone required to take certain uniform subjects when obviously people have vastly different interests? Maybe that's why people get bored and when they're in school and don't learn, because they're not allowed to take and to specifically structure their learning around the topics they're interested in. I believe there's a reason, and it's a sinister reason, why there's a uniformity to the subject materials that children are forced to learn in school. And that's why I believe homeschooling, again, is far superior, because it can address what the children really want to learn. So I'm thinking, why is math one of those basic classes? It certainly isn't because the lessons that math is supposed to teach, which are reasoning, critical thinking, intellect, are taught. No, those lessons are not taught, because even the bankers and industrialists have dumbed down how math is taught. As crazy as that sounds, math was taught completely differently 100 years ago. So perhaps is math important because bankers and industrialists modified math classes over the past 100 years excuse me, to strip all reasoning and critical thinking skills from math and to replace them with asinine rote memorization of multiplication tables and the like that are designed to implement certain behavioral patterns in children instead. If you think this is speculation and not fact, excuse me, I suggest you research for yourself how math was taught in schools. I always say that in all my videos. I said, don't believe anything I say, but research it for yourself, because you're more apt to believe it once you research it for yourself and find out what I'm saying is true. Research how math was taught in schools before the Industrial Revolution and after. And I guarantee you that the vast differences in how math was taught then and how it was taught now will absolutely shock you. Now, if we look to John Dewey, if you look at this progression of how the industrialists and bankers change education to serve their purpose and interests, John Dewey was a behavioral scientist hired by the Rockefellers. Remember, the Rockefellers established the premier institute for education and learning in America. You know, the Education Board, General Education Board, I believe is what it was called. So the Rockefellers hired John Dewey to help shape the academic programs in America. Dewey published the Human Manifesto 1 in 1933 in the New Humanist, Volume 6, published in Yellow Springs, Ohio, for all of you that want to look it up yourself. The basis, and this is what he wrote in this book, quote, again, quote, you cannot argue with quotes of what these people wanted in the academic system. The basis of humanist belief is that there is no almighty God, the creator and sustainer of life. Humanists believe that man is his own God. They believe that moral values are relative, devised according to the needs of particular people, and that ethics are likewise situational. Humanists reject Judeo-Christian moral and ethical laws, end quote. If you realize that every last banker that is running the global banking platform is a humanist and believes that he is his own God, which they do, and that they should do as thou wilt, then you can begin to understand why the Rockefellers have often been quoted as having disdain for all of us and for stating that they should make all the decisions in the world because we are too stupid to make them. They have actually made these comments. If you understand the humanist belief of bankers, you will understand why people like Jamie Dimon, Stuart Gulliver, Lloyd Blankfein, Brian Moynihan, and all of their peers can often make decisions for their banks that create misery for millions of people without any guilt or conscience. And that becomes very easy to understand if you look at the history. It's nearly impossible for someone not bound by the same ethics as you and me to not suffer guilt for the decisions they make that create suffering for millions, in the case of bankers for billions. But if you understand their humanist beliefs, then you understand why it's so easy for them to have no guilt or conscience about the decisions they make. So let me read you another quote from John Dewey's Humanist Manifesto, who the Rockefellers hired to shape the academic system. Quote, "For the humanist, man's greatness is coming of age. His total fulfillment is found when he no longer needs the idea of God. Man gets rid of God, not just to do what he wills, but to regain possession of human greatness." Again, this quote is so, end quote, this quote is so important because if you realize that industrialists and bankers consulted its author, John Dewey, to formulate the modern day education system, it's scary enough when you realize that this is the idea that guides all the big criminal bankers today. But it should be absolutely terrifying if you realize that these principles are what guides all institutional academic schooling programs around the world today. Well, I can't be absolute in that saying like, oh, but the majority of institutional academic schooling programs today. So this is why bankers will never ever adhere to the golden rule, which is a topic I discussed in a previous podcast. Again, the link if you want to watch that podcast, I'll provide it below in the references in the YouTube description. So let's keep looking at this timeline. Actually, that was in the 1930s, so I'm going to go back. I shouldn't have skipped because this is really important. January 13, 1918, right? You have to remember the Federal Reserve. These bankers founded the Federal Reserve in 1913, I believe it was. So 1918, just around that time. William Boyce Thompson, Federal Reserve Bank Director, and guess what else? Founding member of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, stated that Russia was the model to which the U.S. should aspire to in looking for great and sweeping changes. He stated, quote, "It is not in Russia alone that the old order is passing. There is a lot of the old order in America, and that is going too. I'm glad it is so. When I sat and watched those democratic conclaves in Russia, I felt I would welcome a similar scene in the United States." End quote. Again, remember, if you remember that this is America's central banker making the statement, it shouldn't be too hard to understand that the whole idea of central banks are based upon communist ideology. And in fact, if you just read the planks again of communism, the 10 planks, the most central important plank of communism is the fact that the central bank exists to control the monetary supply of a nation and therefore control the people. The late Professor Carroll Quigley of Georgetown University described the CFR, of which William Boyce Thompson, beside being director of the Feds, was a founder, said, quote, "The CFR is, quote, a front for J.P. Morgan and Company in association with a very small American Round Table Group," end quote. Quigley further stated, quote, "The board of the CFR have carried ever since the marks of their origin. There grew up in the 20th century a power structure between London and New York which penetrated deeply into university life, the press, and the practice of foreign policy," end quote. Again, for those of you that don't know, Carroll Quigley was an extremely important mentor to former U.S. President Bill Clinton by Clinton's own admission. And again, as you can see, when I always talk about connecting the dots between things that apparently seem unrelated, you can see how everything is connected. So, how was education different in the U.S.? Around the world, before the Industrial Revolution and before bankers and industrialists got their hands on reshaping the educational curricula, it was like night and day. If you're interested in discovering how different, I'll discuss these differences in detail in our new Smart Wealth program that we're going to release at some point during the first half of this year, 2015. And though we haven't released it, if this kind of information does fascinate you, we discuss a lot more, again, even just in our fact sheet. Our fact sheet is very detailed about our new Smart Wealth program, and that is educational program that's available. Just if you go to www.smartknowledgeu.com, you'll see a link where you can download our fact sheet to the Smart Wealth education program, yet unreleased. So let's move forward, though, keep moving forward, discussing the timeline of how industrialists and bankers completely reshaped education to become much more about behavioral conditioning than learning. okay, if we move forward by another decade in the 1930s, who do we look to that funded a project that was to be embedded in the American education system? The Carnegie Corporation in New York, when they spent $340,000 in the 1930s to fund this project. So you got to remember, this is in the 1930s. So if you adjust the $340,000 to inflation-adjusted dollars, we're talking that would be the equivalent of likely tens of millions of dollars. So with this book, I'm going to read direct quotes again from this book. So, absent of my opinion, when you hear these quotes, even for the staunchest skeptic of the true motivation for institutional academics that I have thus far discussed in this podcast, it should become crystal clear again the motivation of industrialists and bankers in reshaping our modern education system. Remember, Andrew Carnegie, the top industrialist at that time, and John D. Rockefeller, the top banker at that time, spent more of their own money to shape the education system than did the U.S. government. And if you believe that they did so out of the kindness and compassion of their hearts versus desire to control people, then I don't know. I guess I have some swampland in Florida to sell you, or I believe you're waiting for Santa Claus on Christmas and the Tooth Fairy every time your children loses a tooth. You believe the Tooth Fairy will supply the money underneath the bed. Because what people know about bankers today and industrialists and their intentions are just confirmed by this book in the 1930s. So again, understand that these are not my opinions. This is not my paraphrasing even. These are direct quotes from this book. Quote, American civilization, in common with Western civilization, is passing through one of the great critical ages of history and is modifying its traditional faith in economic individualism and is embarking upon vast experiments in social planning and control which call for large-scale cooperation on the part of the people, end quote. Quote, the implications for education are clear and imperative. 1. The efficient functioning of the emerging economy and the full utilization of its potentialities require profound changes in the attitudes and outlook of the American people, especially the rising generation. A complete and frank recognition that the old order is passing, that the new order is emerging, end quote. So note, okay, this is my commentary. Note that even in the 1930s, the bankers and industrialists were talking about reshaping a new world order. Okay, quote, organized public education in the United States, much more than ever before, is now compelled, if it is to fulfill its social obligations, to adjust its objectives, its curriculum, its methods of instruction, and its administrative procedures to the requirements of the emerging integrated order, end quote. Okay, to supplement that, so these were books on a study for how society should be reshaped through education funded by the Carnegies. So let me read passages from another book in another country about education from that time period when industrialists and bankers were gathering together all around the world to determine the purposes of education. You will find that they sound scarily similar to the conclusions of the Carnegie Foundation Project. Quote, in many of the individual subjects, the material to be learned has increased to such an extent that only a fraction of it sticks in the individual's head, and only a fraction of this abundance can be used, while on the other hand, it is not enough for the purpose of a man working and is living in a certain field. Take, for instance, the ordinary civil servant who has graduated from secondary school or from the upper school system when he is 35 or 40 and test the school learning which he once so painfully acquired. How little of all the stuff that was then drummed into him still remains? One will indeed be answered, yes, but the object of the amount that was learned was not simply to put a man in possession of a great deal of information later, but to train his power of intellectual absorption and the thinking power, particularly the power of observation of the brain. Quote, thus the main object of learning so much is lost, for after all it cannot consist in making the brain able to learn by unmeasured piling up of instruction, but in creating for later life a fund of knowledge which the individual needs and which through him much more benefits society. Summing up, the populist state will have to put general scholastic instruction into a shortened form, including the very essentials. Outside of that, opportunity must be offered for thorough, specialized, scholarly training, end quote. So the interesting thing to note, okay, this is my commentary now, is that it said general scholastic instruction will have to be shortened. So this is part of how education was changed pre-industrial revolution and post-industrial revolution, because there was a massive amount of learning of material that was required to be learned pre-industrial revolution, because it was believed, as was said in this quote, that the object of the amount that was learned was not simply to put a man in possession of a great deal of information later, but to train his power of intellectual absorption and the thinking power. So the reason to shorten the amount of information that was taught post-industrial revolution was basically to retard the intellectual absorption and the thinking power. So that is very interesting. Now, you want to know what book these quotes came from? They're from Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. So apparently, probably a lot of you will find that shocking, because it seems to be the model from which also most Western education, institutional academics, was taken from. So if you see that American educators changed the schooling system to fit their needs during the Industrial Revolution, you'll discover that American educators embraced a lot of Hitler's concepts to formulate our modern-day global education system. And again, all you need to do to see how intellectual thinking was a much more essential part of education pre-industrial revolution, just research, just Google what's called the McGuffey readers, MC, capital G-U-F-F-E-Y, that were used to teach children in the 1800s. And you will discover quickly how much education has been dumbed down today. Because if you look at the readers and the complexity of the education that they were learning, at what age, you will see that that education had been so dumbed down that back then, 6th to 7th graders, 1800s, were perhaps learning a lot of the same subject material as university seniors today at the so-called finest universities. And again, another way you can see the great differences, because I'm not going to go into great detail on this podcast, is if you download any of the free books I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast by John Gatto, you'll also discover the great dumbing down of not only U.S. education, I'm sorry, all global education, post-industrial revolution. So the importance of changing this education curricula worldwide went from being one focused on a general liberal arts education, pre-industrial revolution, to one post-industrial revolution that was focused on shaping the thoughts, feelings, and actions of children to ensure that they would collectively fit into society and be obedient to those in authority without disruption or without challenging the elite's guidance and their immoral actions in today's world. So this type of passivity and subservience that bankers and industrialists have hammered into children through the academic system is most likely the reason we have been able to, they have been able to destroy economies in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and America, and that we have not yet risen up with. I mean, I know there's been lots of protests and lots of clashes between police and the state and the people in these countries, but there has not been the hint of a true, real revolution, like full-blown revolution against them as of yet. And I believe part of the reason why this is because of the success of the behavioral modification programs that are implemented in all institutions of academic learning today. I shouldn't even say academic learning, because that's an oxymoron, because they're not taught to how children learn. They're taught to modify they're built, structured to modify behavior. So all this information too that I've discussed as far as literally the tip of the iceberg of available documents that proves that education was eventually exported, the American model, to the rest of the world, and that was re-engineered during the Industrial Revolution specifically to modify children's behavior to fit into their new world order, and really has no basis in creating learned school children and young adults capable of thinking for themselves and acting independently from collective thought and behavior, society at large, once they evolve into adults. So before I end this podcast, we're winding it down, I'm going to get into just some things that I think, just from reading about education, are completely wrong about how it's structured. So today you see kids slotted into grades, right? So they're all about the same age, give or take a few months. in the classroom. And I believe kids should not be slotted into grades. That's incredibly limiting towards learning behavior and towards intellectual development, because kids don't progress at the same physical age, at the same rates, just because they're same physical age. That is one of the most idiotic assumptions in the way that learning is educational institutions are structured today. And actually, I don't even think it's an assumption. I think that the elites know exactly what they're doing, because they want to limit children's learning. So that's why they slot them into classrooms with children all the same age. Because again, I'm going to use again as an analogy martial arts. In martial arts, kids don't progress at the same rate. So just because they're the same age, they can start. There's 10 kids in a martial arts class, place 10 kids in a martial arts class, the same physical age. I guarantee you they're not going to progress at the same rate in the progression of different colored belts. I guarantee you that some kids are going to achieve a black belt in half the time as other kids, and that they're all going to progress and be at different belt levels. And some kids will be at the same belt level, but there's a lot of kids that are going to progress at different levels. Can you imagine if these martial arts schools and the sensei did not allow any child to move up from a white belt to a yellow belt until every single last child was ready to move on from his or her white belt? Can you imagine that? Because that's the school system. We don't allow kids to progress in certain subject materials, even if they have a greater affinity and greater ability for that subject level. So, even in the schooling system itself, if I use an analogy, how come there's no 5th grade art and no 8th grade art? How come in high school there's no 9th grade art and no 12th grade art? Because art classes don't limit a child's ability to excel. So you have some children that have affinity for art that just excel in the art class, and others that don't. So neither should this be the scenario for math classes, chemistry classes, history classes, literature classes, any of these other classes. It's patently stupid to require all children to graduate from every class with the exact same set of standard bland knowledge, when they may progress in their learning at different rates, at different subject materials. It makes much more sense to maybe group them in groups of 5 years. So put kids from 10 to 15 together, 15 to 18 together, put kids from like 6 to 10 together, stuff like that. Put them in groups of 5 years apart, because then they can all learn from each other, and that would be the most beneficial and most efficient way of teaching. And again, I want to end this podcast with one last anecdotal story. As someone approached me and told me that they had trained in mixed martial arts every day for the last 10 years, specifically working on one punching technique that they had literally practiced hundreds of thousands of times, and also on perfecting one submission technique, say like an arm bar, every day over the last 10 years. And I, on the other hand, had zero formal fighting training other than a few scuffles in bars when I was like 18 or 17 years old. And they asked me if I would like to fight them for $100,000 in the octagon. You know how many times I would say yes out of 100 times? I would say yes 0 times out of 100 times if that were the situation. So why is it when I tell people that I study the banking system and gold and silver markets every day for more than a decade now, and tell them what I understand to be true, that the majority, I would say 95% of people will hem and haw in disbelief and tell me that I am flat out wrong, when after I have learned that they have not even spent a single full day studying gold and silver markets, and they're just basically basing their argument off of what they've heard on TV or read in the newspaper, or what they've heard in the classroom environment when they were school children. But this happens to me dozens of times every year. From a logical standpoint, this would be like me speaking to a nuclear physicist and insisting that the process of nuclear fission that he was explaining to me was completely wrong, even though he had studied this process for over a decade, and I, on the other hand, had spent perhaps 1 hour in high school studying this topic. It's like, how completely arrogant and narcissistic of that, that scenario would that make me? So this happens to me dozens of times. So I would think, why does this happen to me? It's not that I'm saying there's no one out there that knows more about the global banking system, about global silver markets than myself. Of course, there are other people that know more than I do. As you know, with any topic, no matter how much of an expert you are, there's always going to be someone that knows more than you. I'm saying it's patently ridiculous when these people tell me, when I ask them, what is the basis of your argument? Oh, I heard it said on Bloomberg. I heard it on Reuters. And look, these guys are on TV. You think you know more than guys are on TV that are telling us? Of course. Because look at Brian Williams. Look at, who's that other guy? On Fox News, Bill O'Reilly. These guys have been caught flat out lying because they're talking heads. If you really think they're journalists, that is a sign of incredible naivete, because they're just basically actors hired to tell people propaganda that the global bankers and the global industrialists want people to believe. So in fact, the last time someone insisted they understood more about me, about the global banking system than me, that told me they had no background in it whatsoever. It just happened last week. So, and this is what happened. I met an American when I was on the road for business, and he kept saying I was wrong about the U.S. Federal Reserve being a privately owned bank run by private bankers for their own benefit and not for the benefit of anyone else in this world. And he stated, furthermore, he was positive that the U.S. Federal Reserve was a federal organization run by the U.S. government. Not that he thought it was, but he said, I'm positive you're wrong. And furthermore, he told me the goal of the government run U.S. Federal Reserve was price stability. And he said that they were achieving this goal every year. So I said, look, I studied this topic for more than 10 years, and I'm telling you, there are facts and documents that will prove you're wrong. And he still insisted he was right and I was wrong. He's like, just, you're wrong. That's what he kept saying to me. I said, look, I could provide a link to a YouTube video in which the most infamous Federal Reserve chairman of all, Alan Greenspan, admits that the U.S. Federal Reserve does not answer to the U.S. government. So why would he say that? The U.S. Federal Reserve is totally independent and acts totally independently of the U.S. government if it's a U.S. government-run organization, like you said it is. And this person still, then you know what he did? He expressed skepticism that this video existed. He said, I'm making that up. And this is how I know, I'm sure, that the bankers program of reconditioning people through the academic school system has been extremely successful, because I meet people like this all the time. So after 15 minutes of talking to this guy, I knew that even if I told him that the privately run and owned U.S. Central Bank had destroyed 98% of the U.S. dollar's purchasing power over the last 100 years, and that this should be more than ample proof that the mission of the U.S. Federal Reserve does not promote price stability or does not have an objective of price stability, and I knew his response would be just something that, again, would support his own position, and that he would still remain truly argumentative that I was wrong and he was right. And I wouldn't have shocked me if he would start arguing that 98% inflation was good for the people. Because, in fact, just a day later, I met someone else that indeed argued with me that inflation is good for the people. So this is the importance of this podcast. Because believe it or not, if you take the time to really understand what I'm saying in this podcast, take the time to research the information in this podcast with the many references I'll provide in the YouTube description of this podcast, and understand how the goals and bankers and industrialists in education have clouded our thinking. This understanding, I 100% believe, will vastly improve your investment outcomes, because you will no longer base your choices on herd mentality or be so quick to accept the mainstream media memes about the economy and investing. Because if you do this own exercise, because again, I always urge everyone never to believe just what I say in the podcast. Do your own research, form your own conclusions. That's the best way to truly promote learning. Do this and then come back to me like a year later and tell me that this exercise did not save your investing life this year in 2015. And in fact, you can go to the books from which I quoted. The books, as I'll provide a list of these references again in the YouTube description of this podcast. Confirm the quotes yourself. Conduct your own research. Come to your own conclusions independent of this podcast. It's the only way, I believe, to reach a valid conclusion on any topic. And again, we'll be discussing this topic much more in detail with many more topics on our soon-to-be-launched Smart Wealth educational program available at our website, www.smartknowledgeu.com, at some point in the first half of 2015. Now, Albert Einstein described education as, quote, the value of an education is not the learning of many facts, but the training of the mind to think something that cannot be learned from textbooks. I 100% agree with this definition of education, and my dissatisfaction with the current curricula of modern education that focuses on rote memorization and learning of many facts with very little or sometimes no training of the mind to think something that cannot be learned from textbooks is the very reason I designed the Smart Wealth Online Education curriculum that explores the topics I present in this podcast in much more detail, and also equally as important, covers all the truth about the global monetary and banking system that was entirely absent from my so-called elite undergraduate education and my 2 master degrees that I achieved. It was completely absent. So everything that was absent from these programs is in my Smart Wealth Online Education curriculum. And I wholly believe that today's institutional schooling system is a complete waste of time and money in training the mind. And that online education courses, if they address the grave deficiencies of institutional academia today, can offer 10 times the value at 1/10 the price. Okay, so that's it for today. Again, don't forget to visit us at www.smartknowledgeu.com. Thank you for listening. If you made it through the whole end, if you made it to the end of this podcast, and as always, remain intensely curious.